Dogg couldn't walk through Los Angeles without looking over his shoulder. Suge Knight, once his protector, now a threat, had turned from label boss to looming shadow. And yet, years later, in a quiet, unexpected moment, they sat down, not to fight, not to rehash beef, but to talk. 3 hours, no cameras, no entourages, just two men with a long, bloody history and one question hanging in the air. Can enemies ever find peace? Let's rewind. The beginning of brotherhood. Before there was bad blood, there was brotherhood. In the early 90s, Snoop Dogg was a lanky, smooth-voiced MC out of Long Beach with a raw edge and unmatched flow. Suge Knight was the ruthless powerhouse from Compton, building an empire called Death Row Records. Their paths crossed at a time when hip-hop was transforming, and together they helped shape its future. Suge saw something in Snoop that others didn't. Backed by Dr. Dre's production, Snoop's debut album, Doggy Style, dropped in 1993 and shattered expectations. It wasn't just platinum, it was cultural, and it stamped Death Row as the most feared, respected, and talked about label in music. Behind the scenes, Suge acted as more than a CEO. He was Snoop's shield. According to Snoop, Suge personally stepped in during his murder trial in the mid-90s, helping keep him free when others might have cut ties. The two weren't just working together, they were riding together. Convoys, clubs. The aura of Death Row stretched from Beverly Hills to South Central. But even in those early days, there were signs of tension. Suge was known for power moves, intimidation, contracts that blurred the lines between business and ownership. Snoop, on the other hand, had a mind of his own. As the fame grew, so did the distance between artist and boss. And while they might have stood shoulder to shoulder in public, behind closed doors, cracks were forming. Still, it was hard to see the storm coming. At this stage, they were kings of the West. Death Row was unstoppable, Snoop was untouchable, and Suge was untamed. But as history would show, no dynasty lasts forever. And for Snoop and Suge, the fall would be just as epic as the rise, when loyalty turned to fear. The fall didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it hit like a freight train. By the mid-1990s, the energy around Death Row had shifted. The label that once stood for power and unity was now drowning in paranoia, violence, and betrayal. Snoop Dogg, once Suge's golden child, began to feel the weight of that shift. In 1996, Tupac was gunned down in Las Vegas. Suge was behind the wheel that night, and after Pac's death, Death Row started to unravel fast. The streets whispered, and so did the industry. Death Row wasn't safe anymore. Snoop knew it too. Suddenly, the label that launched him was the same one he feared might take him out. Rumors swirled that Suge was furious with Snoop, not just for leaving the label, but for doing it on his own terms. Snoop refused to sign over rights, refused to stay quiet, and most of all, refused to bow. In Suge's world, that kind of disobedience didn't go unanswered. There were near misses, run-ins in clubs, muted threats, and always that unshakable tension. Would there be a confrontation? Would Suge retaliate? For years, Snoop moved like a man on edge. He built his own brand, collaborated with new labels, and quietly kept a distance from anything tied to his Death Row past. He never dissed Suge publicly, but he didn't trust him either. The man who once stood beside him on stage was now the reason he kept looking over his shoulder. The world saw Snoop smiling, touring, dropping hits. But behind the scenes, he was navigating a game that could turn deadly in an instant. And then, just when no one expected it, the two men would come face to face again, not in violence, but in conversation. And it wouldn't be short, it would be 3 hours long. The unlikely meeting. For over a decade, Snoop and Suge's paths didn't cross. One was busy becoming a global icon, the other sinking deeper into a world of legal chaos. Suge was eventually convicted in 2018 for manslaughter and sentenced to 28 years. Snoop, meanwhile, had reinvented himself multiple times. Rapper, entrepreneur, TV personality, even youth football coach. From Long Beach to global stages, he'd evolved far beyond the man he was during the Death Row days. But beef, even when cold, has a strange way of lingering. Snoop never went out of his way to bash Suge. He didn't diss him in interviews or songs, but he didn't forget the tension either. That's why when they finally did cross paths again, it wasn't in a planned meeting. It was spontaneous and dangerous. Snoop could have panicked. He could have walked away, or worse, escalated. But he didn't. In that moment, he did something almost nobody expected. He invited Suge to talk. Not yell, not argue, just talk. and Suge accepted. What followed was something nobody had ever predicted. A long, honest, face-to-face conversation between two men who once shared a throne and then nearly destroyed each other. It wasn't on camera, no publicists, no entourage, just Snoop and Suge behind closed doors, unpacking over a decade of silence, threats, and pain. The air was thick with everything unspoken. The past was sitting in the room with them, but instead of swinging, they spoke. For 3 hours, two legends who had every reason to stay enemies did something few men in their position ever do. They listened, and what came out of that meeting would surprise everyone, even Snoop. The 3-hour peace talk. What do you say to the man you once feared might take your life? For Snoop Dogg, it started with honesty. No script, no bravado, just two men locked in a room, decades of tension on the table. And to Snoop's surprise, Suge didn't come in angry. He came in wounded. That line cut deep. All of Suge's reputation, the intimidation, the power plays, this wasn't about hatred. It was about control. Suge had built Death Row like a fortress, and Snoop was supposed to be one of his pillars. But Snoop had outgrown the structure. He was too free, too ambitious, too independent. And that, more than anything, fractured their bond. Snoop said they didn't argue. They didn't revisit every beef or try to settle scores. They talked about love, respect, regret, the things nobody expects two gangsters to speak on. And in those 3 hours, something cracked open. Snoop didn't forgive blindly. He saw the damage, the threats, the fear that Suge's name had carried for years. But he also saw a man who had lost his empire, a man sitting in a prison of his own making. And instead of kicking him while he was down, Snoop offered something rare: empathy. It wasn't a handshake deal. There was no contract signed. But by the time they left that room, the war was over. Not erased, but paused. Two titans of West Coast rap, once locked in a silent feud, had reached a strange and unexpected truce. And Snoop wasn't done. What he took from that talk would shape how he saw loyalty and legacy for the rest of his life.
This is the time for me to be there for him and be his friend, be loved, because you never know when you're going to be down and out.
What Snoop learned. That conversation didn't just bring closure, it gave Snoop clarity. For years, he'd carried the weight of Death Row, not just as an artist who helped build it, but as a survivor of the chaos it created. The 3-hour talk with Suge gave him something he didn't know he needed: peace. He walked out of that room different, not because he'd forgotten the past, but because he finally understood it. Snoop began speaking about the meeting publicly, but always with restraint. He never spilled every detail. That wasn't the point. What mattered wasn't what was said, but what was felt. He realized that forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was freedom. That love wasn't about friendship, it was about legacy. Snoop recognized that Suge, for all his flaws, helped launch a movement. And if anyone was going to tell that story right, it had to be him, not the tabloids, not a Netflix documentary. In later interviews, Snoop said that if there's ever a Death Row movie, it should be told through his and Suge's eyes. Not from the outside looking in, but from the men who lived it. Snoop had moved on. He was running youth football leagues, making TV shows, launching wine brands, even acquiring Death Row Records in 2022, but that conversation stuck with him. It wasn't just a turning point, it was a reminder. Legacy isn't just about music, it's about how you carry history, and Snoop was done carrying grudges, now he was carrying lessons, and he was just getting started. Suge's side of the story. While Snoop walked away from their conversation feeling renewed, Suge Knight's version of events took a different turn. From behind bars, Suge launched his own platform, a prison podcast where he still spoke like a boss, a shot caller, a man who hadn't forgotten a single slight. And when it came to Snoop, Suge's tone wasn't warm, it was sharp, even bitter. In Suge's eyes, the past wasn't history, it was leverage. He reminded listeners that he put everything on the line for Snoop during that 1996 murder case. He paid legal fees, shielded Snoop from heat, and expected loyalty in return. So when Snoop left Death Row, then later returned to buy it without his blessing, Suge saw it as betrayal. Even after their conversation, Suge didn't hold back. He claimed Snoop never truly repped Death Row the way Pac did. He suggested that Snoop aligned himself with enemies, that Snoop's forgiveness wasn't forgiveness, it was a way to rewrite the story. To Suge, legacy legacy wasn't about peace, it was about power. And if he wasn't the one telling the story, he questioned whether the story was real at all. But even in his frustration, there was something deeper, a hint of regret. Beneath the anger, Suge seemed like a man who lost control of the empire he built and was watching his enemies become legends. Snoop had moved on. Suge, still stuck behind prison bars, was watching the world change without him. And as the years passed, their conversation would become more than just a private moment. It would become a symbol of what power does and what forgiveness can't always fix.
He had the name Death Row. That's a motherfucking lie. Snoop, you know the truth. Don't be playing these games. That's all I'm going to say. Secondly, they investigated me for money laundering, racketeering, everything you can think of. Went all through my accounts ever. Nobody never gave me no bread, but at the same time, Mike, you get on these things with extra, whatever they fuck is, they're going to get sued for slander in a minute, start coming from their asses aggressively, and say that you gave me some real estate money, gave me a check. Produce the check. And if you know it ain't no check, I know it ain't no check. I'm talking about Michael Harris did the interview, said he gave me a check. Produce the check. And if you can't produce the check, set that bitch ass shit up. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, there's no way to lose my company. They committed fraud against me.
Power, pride, and the prison walls. Suge may have been locked away, but his pride remained untouched. Even from a prison cell, he spoke with the authority of a man who still believed he owned part of the culture. In his mind, Death Row wasn't just a label, it was his legacy. And watching Snoop take control of that legacy without him cut deep. Snoop's 2022 acquisition of Death Row Records was a full circle moment for fans. He went from being a young artist under Suge's thumb to owning the very label that nearly consumed him. It was symbolic, the student becoming the master, the survivor becoming the storyteller. But Suge didn't see it that way. To Suge, this wasn't a celebration, it was erasure. He believed the industry had turned him into a villain and handed his legacy to the very people he once led. And in a way, that stung more than the prison sentence. For Snoop, however, the move wasn't personal. In his own words, it was about protecting something sacred. He wanted to preserve Death Row's catalog, clean up its reputation, and give it new life under his guidance, not Suge's control. The contrast was stark. Snoop wanted peace and progress. Suge wanted recognition and respect. One man was evolving, the other was stuck replaying the past. And yet, their paths were still linked by music, by memory, and by that one long conversation that neither of them could ever truly walk away from. The war might have ended, but the tension never really disappeared. It just went quiet behind prison walls. The real meaning of forgiveness. For Snoop, forgiveness wasn't just about Suge. It was about himself. He knew what that conversation meant. It wasn't for the headlines. It wasn't to clean up Death Row's image. It was a personal decision to drop a weight he'd carried for years. Because no matter how far he rose, from Long Beach rap battles to Super Bowl halftime shows, there was always a piece of his story tied to Death Row and to Suge. The fear, the tension, the silence, it followed him. And forgiving Suge, that was how he finally cut the cord. He didn't excuse the past. He didn't forget the threats, the control, or the pain. But he chose not to be defined by it. That's why his tone in interviews changed. He stopped speaking on Suge as an enemy. He started talking like someone who had found peace in the chaos. It surprised fans. After all, this was the same man who once needed security just to move around Los Angeles. But maybe that's what made the forgiveness real, because it came from someone who knew the danger and still let it go. Meanwhile, Suge remained in his cell, recording podcast episodes and giving interviews that blurred the line between truth and myth. His legacy was frozen in time. Part feared, part forgotten. But Snoop was moving, expanding, creating. And that's where the gap between them widened. That line captured it all. Snoop's decision wasn't just a hip-hop moment, it was a human one. He didn't do it to fix Suge. He did it to free himself. And in doing so, he gave us a reminder that sometimes the strongest move isn't retaliation, it's release. A legacy shared, a story divided, As the dust settled and years passed, one thing became clear. The story of Death Row couldn't be told without both names, Snoop and Suge. Their legacies are inseparable, even if their views on that legacy will never align. Snoop now stands as the unexpected guardian of Death Row's future. When he bought the label in 2022, he wasn't just acquiring a business, he was reclaiming a chapter of his life. But unlike Suge, Snoop didn't want control for domination. He wanted it to evolve. He made bold moves, pulling the label's catalog from streaming platforms to restructure rights, signing new talent, and promising to shine a light on artists who'd been left behind in the chaos of the 90s. It was about restoration, not revenge. Suge, watching from prison, wasn't impressed. In his mind, you can't rewrite history. You can't claim legacy if you weren't riding during the war. To him, Snoop had abandoned Death Row when things got hard, and now, years later, he was trying to wear the crown. But Snoop never claimed to be king. What he claimed was the right to tell the story and to finish it on his own terms. That quote, simple, reflective, holds the final weight of their journey. Snoop wasn't trying to erase Suge. He was inviting him to finally sit down, not as enemies or business rivals, but as men who lived through a cultural earthquake. The real question is, will Suge ever sit at that table? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing is certain, their legacies are locked together forever. Not by contracts, not by money, but by everything they built and everything they survived. From war to words. In the world of hip-hop, very few stories come full circle. Most end in silence, violence, or bitterness. But the tale of Snoop and Suge, it gave us something rare, a conversation. Not a press release, not a staged photo op. A real, raw, 3-hour exchange between two men who were once family, then enemies, and now something in between. That conversation didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the threats, the fear, or the betrayal, but it did something more powerful. It proved that peace is possible, even when history says it isn't. Snoop came out of that room lighter, more focused, ready to carry Death Row into a new era, not with the same fists that built it, but with vision and respect. Suge, still in prison, kept holding on to the empire he once ruled. But now, the world was listening to Snoop, and maybe that's the hardest part for a man like Suge. Realizing that power can be inherited without force. That legacy can be passed down not with fear, but with understanding. In the end, they both told their truths. One from behind bars, one from behind the mic. And now, it's your turn. Who do you think gained the most from that conversation, Snoop or Suge? Drop your answer in the comments. Was it closure? Was it strategy? Or was it something neither of them fully understood? Tap like if you believe stories like this deserve to be told. And hit subscribe for more real moments from the legends who lived them. This isn't just hip-hop history. This is human history, told by the ones who survived it.
Respawn when you fall asleep. Real life don't reload, ain't no extra clip. That's the lesson learned. Why I can't